Night settles over Urbino like a velvet curtain. Inside the palace, candlelight flickers across marble floors once trodden by Duke's soldiers and scholars. The air smells faintly of wax parchment, and something older of the quiet after centuries of grandeur. It is the winter of 1622, and in one of the gilded chambers of the Palazzo Ducale, a newborn's cry pierces the silence. Her name is Vittoria della Rovere, the last heir of a family that once believed itself eternal. The Della Rovere had been sculpted by ambition. A century earlier, their banners had flown across Italy. Their blood had ascended to the throne of St. Peter twice. One ancestor, Pope Sixtus IV, had filled Rome with Renaissance beauty, commissioning the Sistine Chapel, whose painted vaults seemed to suspend heaven itself above the Vatican. Another Pope, Julius II, had summoned Michelangelo, Raphael and Bramante, shaping an empire of art that outlasted his wars. The Della Rovere name was woven into the very fresco of Italian civilization. Yet, like all frescoes, the colours had begun to fade. By the time Vittoria was born, the proud Duchy of Urbino, cradle of humanist brilliance, was little more than an echo. The city that once nurtured Raphael now slept behind stone walls, its courtyards haunted by the footsteps of servants and the murmur of declining fortune. The Renaissance had moved on. Power had shifted to the merchant republics and the papal court. Urbino's dukes, once princes of art and war, were now custodians of memory. Her father, Federico Ubaldo della Rovere, was young, barely 18, when fate struck its cruelest blow. He had inherited the duchy too soon, and life left him too early. The chronicles say he died suddenly in 1623, scarcely a year after his daughter's birth. Some whispered it was epilepsy, others poisoned the quiet weapon of courts where smiles were masks and alliances sharper than daggers. Whatever the truth, his death left the duchy without a living heir and a child duchess who could barely hold her own name. The corridors that once rang with Federico's laughter grew still. In the echo of those halls, servants began to lower their voices when they spoke of the future. The child, barely walking, was carried past ancestral portraits, soldiers, bishops, scholars, all watching with the painted eyes as if wondering whether their legacy would die in her cradle. Her mother, Claudia de' Medici, stood at the centre of a storm she could not control. Daughter of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, she carried in her veins the formidable Medici blood, the blood of Florence's golden age of merchants who had become monarchs, of men who had learned that wealth could build cathedrals and topple kings. Her marriage to Federico had been a union of two powers, Urbino's lineage and Tuscany's wealth, a political equation meant to fortify both families. But with her husband gone and her daughter still an infant, Claudia faced an empire reduced to paperwork. For in early modern Italy, a woman's sovereignty was a legal question, not a birthright. Some duchies permitted female rule, others hid behind ancient codes and patriarchal uncertainty. The matter of Urbino's succession was argued not on the battlefield, but in the Vatican's halls of marble and ink. Old men bent over ledgers and maps tracing inheritance lines like veins on a dying hand. In 1625, the final decision came from Pope Urban VIII, whose signature carried the weight of God's earthly authority. Urbino. This beacon of Renaissance humanism would no longer be ruled by the Della Rovere. It would be absorbed into the papal states, swallowed whole by the machinery of Rome. Thus the duchy did not fall to invasion or rebellion. It fell to bureaucracy. Dynasties often die not with swords but with pens. The annexation was rationalized as an act of divine order, the church reclaiming its own. Yet beneath the papal seal lay a quieter tragedy. A civilization that had once sculpted saints and philosophers was now signed away as a footnote in a ledger. Urbino's independence vanished into parchment dust, its freedom traded for papal oversight. Vittoria's inheritance, the wealth, the art, the lands, was divided and reclassified. She was compensated with the duchies of Rovere and Montefeltro, small enclaves within a larger papal domain, and the family's legendary art collection, jewels, tapestries and masterpieces by Titian and Raphael, relics of a vanished glory. The child duchess became a living archive, a symbol of what Urbino had been and what Italy was becoming, a mosaic of broken crowns under Rome's shadow. We can imagine her in those years, a solemn girl with dark eyes, too old for her age, wandering the palace corridors while servants whispered prayers for the family's soul. Through high windows she might have seen the hills of marsh rolling towards the horizon, their slopes still dotted with the olive groves her ancestors once ruled. The world outside seemed eternal, only her lineage crumbled. Around her, Italy itself was fragmenting into a delicate balance of ambition and faith. The papal states Tuscany, Venice and Savoy, each a world unto itself, each guarded by its own saints and secrets. The Renaissance had taught men to dream of reason, but the Counter-Reformation reminded them to fear the soul. Power was shifting from art to obedience. In that atmosphere, half illuminated, half shadowed, Vittoria della Rovere came of age. She would never know the Urbino her ancestors built, but she would carry its memory like a relic. Born between two dynasties, the warrior scholars of the Della Rovere and the calculating princes of the Medici, she embodied both splendour and decline. Her cradle was lined with silk and prophecy that her name would bind two of Italy's greatest houses. Yet beneath the silk there was iron. Her destiny, like her mother's, would not be chosen, but arranged, written by men in council chambers, not whispered by the heart. Outside the palace winter deepened. Snow gathered on the arches of Urbino, softening its Renaissance outlines. The bells of the cathedral tolled vespers, their sound rolling across the valleys like a farewell. In those fading notes one could almost hear the end of an era, the last song of a family whose power had once touched heaven. In time the child would leave Urbino behind, but the silence of those halls would follow her a reminder that dynasties are mortal and that even marble must learn how to die. The Lost Duchess. By the time Vittoria della Rovere could speak her own name, her duchy no longer existed. Urbino, her inheritance, her father's realm, her family's masterpiece, had been dissolved into the papal map like ink into water. The city still stood its towers catching the sun, its people still prayed in the same churches. Yet on parchment, Urbino was no longer a sovereign land. It had become a possession of the church, its dukes replaced by cardinals, its fate sealed not by cannon fire but by signatures. The transition was quiet, bureaucratic and total. The marble halls that once held ducal councils now echoed with the Latin murmur of clerics cataloguing what had been taken. Paintings were inventoried, coins, recast banners folded away. For the Della Rovere, centuries of independence ended with a wax seal, and for a child of 2 this meant a future defined by others, by Rome, by Florence, and by the silent ambitions of those who believed they knew what was best for her. In 1626, Claudia de' Medici, widowed at 24, powerful but precarious, was offered a new alliance. Across the Alps, Archduke Leopold V of Austria sought a bride. The match promised prestige for both sides. Habsburg order joined to Medici gold. For the papacy it was convenient. For Claudia it was survival. Yet the price of her ascent was steep. She would leave Italy, leave Urbino, and most painfully leave her daughter behind. The infant Vittoria, too young to protest, was entrusted to the care of tutors and guardians chosen by the papal court. Her mother departed to Innsbruck with new jewels, new titles, and soon new children. Letters from her became rarer, then formal, the tone of diplomacy, not affection. In the space of a season, Vittoria had lost both her father's land and her mother's voice. Her new home was not a palace, but a convent, the Monastero delle Murate in Florence, first later a retreat near Poggio, a Caiano, and the Villa di Pratolino, both Medici estates. It was thought a safe and proper environment for a girl of noble blood, pious, disciplined, away from intrigue. Yet convent walls, though built of stone, were porous to politics. Imagine the sound of her mornings, the bell tolling before dawn, calling the sisters to prayer. The air cool and faintly scented with wax and rosewater. She learned to kneel before the altar before she ever learned to dance. Latin hymns filled her memory before lullabies did. The nuns taught her the holy languages, silence, obedience, endurance. But they could not silence the world beyond their cloisters. Whispers reached even through iron grills, talk of papal decrees, of Florence's markets, of new alliances forming in Rome. Vittoria's tutors reminded her daily that she was not like the other girls who took vows here. Her fate was not to renounce the world, but to return to it as a symbol of power. They taught her needlework Latin, the catechism, the etiquette of queens. Her handwriting became as elegant as her silence. To be a noble girl in 17th century Italy was to live in a gilded contradiction. You were taught to be pure, yet prepared to be traded, to pray for humility, yet groomed to rule. Marriage in that world was not romance. It was architecture, the joining of houses, like the joining of arches in a cathedral, cold, necessary, enduring. The Medici understood this architecture better than anyone. From Florence's banking halls to its basilicas, they had built their empire on the union of family and faith. Every Medici daughter and cousin was a piece in a centuries-long chess game that spanned Europe's courts from Vienna to Madrid, from Paris to the Vatican. And now, through Claudia's only child, they had acquired a new piece, the last Della Rovere. The irony was exquisite. The Medici who had once painted the ceilings of the Renaissance were now painting their bloodlines. By marrying Claudia to Austria and promising Vittoria to Tuscany, they sealed their presence across both sides of the Alps. As the years passed, Vittoria's world shrank to ritual. She prayed at dawn, studied scripture at noon, embroidered in the afternoon light that filtered through high windows. Her companions were nuns who saw in her both a soul and an asset. They spoke softly of duty, of providence, of sacrifice, lessons meant to prepare her for a destiny decided long ago. Yet within those lessons lay a quiet cruelty. She was taught to mistake obedience for virtue, resignation for grace. Sometimes in the convent garden she would walk among lemon trees and think of the father she never knew. The sisters said he was a good man, that his death was God's will, but even a child could sense the unease in their voices. In her heart, she began to understand what every royal child eventually learns, that love in such families is fragile currency. Florence was near enough that rumours travelled easily. She would hear of the Grand Ducal court of feasts, masks, processions down the Arno of her Medici cousins who glittered in silks while she knelt on cold stone. But she was not forgotten. Her guardians, appointed by both Rome and Florence, ensured she remained visible, a duchess in miniature, a reminder of alliances not yet fulfilled. The convent itself became a theatre of quiet observation. Visitors, envoys, clerics, noble widows came to glimpse her during feast days to report her progress to their patrons. They saw a girl, pale and solemn, already trained in the art of stillness. Some pitied her, others saw promise. Beyond the cloister walls, Europe was transforming. Galileo had stood before the Inquisition. The 30 Years' War raged across Germany. Empires rose and fell in sermons and treaties. Yet within the small circle of Vittoria's world, time moved differently, measured not in decades but in prayers. By the age of 10, she was already fluent in Latin and French, well versed in scripture and decorum. The nuns whispered that she had the mind of a scholar and the heart of a penitent. But her lineage was neither scholarly nor saintly. It was political, and politics soon came calling. In Florence, the Medici matriarchs Maria Magdalena of Austria and the formidable Grand Duchess Christina of Lorraine had begun to arrange the next generation of marriages. They saw in Vittoria not a child but an answer, a way to reunite two lines of their family that had once diverged. Her first cousin, Ferdinando II de' Medici, now ruled as Grand Duke. He was 12 years her senior, already weighed down by expectation and the cautious shadow of his regents. Their match would be a reunion of blood, of wealth, of ambition. For the Medici it was perfection. For the Della Rovere it was survival. And for the girl raised among prayers it was destiny. As the bells tolled one winter evening, the abbess came to her cell with a letter bearing the Medici seal. Vittoria, now 12, traced the crest with her fingertips, the red balls of her mother's house embossed in gold wax. She did not need to read the words to know what they meant. The gates of the convent would open, the prayers would end, and once more she would be traded not as a Duchess of Urbino, but as a bride of Florence, a living bridge between two vanishing worlds. A marriage of calculation. Florence, in the summer of 1634, was a theatre. Trumpets blared across the Arno, banners rippled from every balcony, and the scent of lilies, the city's emblem, mingled with incense and sweat. Beneath the painted ceilings of the Palazzo Pitti, the Medici court prepared for a spectacle that would both unite and preserve their lineage. The marriage of 12-year-old Vittoria della Rovere to Ferdinando de' Medici, her 24-year-old cousin, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany. For Florence, this was no ordinary wedding. It was a public ritual of continuity, a proclamation that the twin pillars of Italy's high nobility, the della Rovere and the Medici, would not crumble but fuse. The city rejoiced, the courtiers calculated. On the morning of the ceremony, Vittoria was led from her carriage through crowds that cheered more for the dynasty than for the bride. She was a small figure draped in brocade, the Medici red threaded with della Rovere blue, her train carried by girls scarcely older than herself. Jewels heavy with family history weighed on her narrow shoulders. To the onlookers she seemed a saint descending from an altar. To those who knew the truth, she was an offering placed upon it. Inside the Duomo, light fell through stained glass like liquid gold. Organs thundered. Priests chanted. As the vows were spoken, the contrast between them was almost surreal. The Grand Duke, tall, solemn, already a man of science and politics, and beside him a child whose eyes barely reached his shoulder. But in the arithmetic of dynasties, affection mattered less than blood geometry. Europe in the 17th century lived under a strange superstition masquerading as logic. The purer the blood, the closer to divine favour. Noble houses intermarried generation after generation, tracing ancestry as if it were scripture. Cousin wedded. Cousin niece married uncle, and with every union the family trees twisted tighter until roots and branches became indistinguishable. The Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon temper, the Medici melancholy, all were the physical echoes of this obsession. To preserve the name was to gamble with the body. In Florence that day, the Medici celebrated the gamble with unrivalled splendour. Chroniclers describe a procession of white horses caparisoned in crimson velvet, of musicians on balconies of fireworks blooming over the river like brief constellations. Even the air seemed perfumed with promise. Yet within the walls of the palace, where courtiers toasted alliances and poets wrote odes, one truth lingered unspoken: this marriage was a calculation, not a covenant. Ferdinando II had inherited not only the throne, but also the unfinished ambitions of his mother, Maria Magdalena of Austria, and his grandmother Christina of Lorraine, the formidable regents who had ruled during his minority. They saw in Vittoria the perfect equation, a cousin, whose dowry brought artland and legitimacy, whose Medici blood would reinforce their own, and whose della Rovere heritage added papal prestige. It was politics distilled to genealogy. The wedding was followed by a week of festivities that blurred the line between devotion and display. The streets filled with tableaus of ancient heroes. Masquerades portrayed Florence as the new Athens. Fountains flowed with wine. But amid the jubilation, the new duchess remained silent. Observers noted her composure, her almost statuesque calm, a stillness that would define her for life. She smiled, rarely spoke softly, and seemed older than her years, as if the gravity of her lineage had already pressed her childhood into marble. For the first years, the marriage remained unconsummated. Officially, the reason was her age. Privately, the Grand Duke's inclinations lay elsewhere. Their chambers were separate, their lives parallel. Ferdinando's nights were spent in his observatory, and laboratories fascinated by alchemy, optics, and the new astronomy whispered from Galileo's persecuted circle. Vittoria's world, meanwhile, revolved around chapels and confessionals. She prayed for guidance, for patience, perhaps for affection. The palace that enclosed them was magnificent and airless. The Medici court was a paradox of the age, both a citadel of art and a prison of expectation. Painters, musicians, and philosophers crowded its galleries, yet gossip ruled its corridors. Servants moved like ghosts, and every conversation had an audience. The scent of oil paint mingled with that of wax and perfume, creating a sweetness that could almost suffocate. At banquets, Vittoria sat beside her husband, her small hands folded perfectly in her lap while courtiers murmured about her dowry, the Della Rovere collection that included Titians, Veroneses, and Raphaels, treasures that would one day form the heart of the Uffizi. They praised her piety, her beauty, her composure. But behind their smiles, they wondered whether the Medici line, already showing signs of frailty, would find renewal in her, or decline further into the narrow corridors of consanguinity. In private moments, the hours before dawn, when the palace was silent save for the creak of the marble floors, Vittoria must have wondered what kind of life had been written for her. She had been born to rule a duchy and instead found herself ruling nothing but her own restraint. Her letters, few that survive, reveal a meticulous hand and a tone of dutiful resignation. She writes of prayer, of her holy purpose, but never of joy. Historians often describe her as cold. Perhaps she was, but one must remember the climate she was raised in. The convent had taught her silence as safety. Florence taught her that silence was power. In a court where women's whispers could start wars, a quiet duchess was an enigma, and an enigma could endure. The years between 1634 and 1640 would pass like slow pages in a ledger. Behind closed doors, physicians monitored her health. Astrologers charted her stars, hoping for signs of fertility when the time came. The Medici needed heirs, and heirs required risk. The irony of royal breeding was merciless. The very purity they prized endangered the children who would secure it. Modern science would later name it genetic collapse. Vittoria lived it as destiny. The deformities, the stillbirths, the strange illnesses that haunted Europe's royal nurseries, all were the unseen cost of dynastic pride. Bloodlines narrowed until even miracles could not widen them. But on the day of her wedding, none of this was spoken. The bells rang, the fireworks soared, and the city celebrated its illusion of immortality. The people of Florence looked upon their child duchess and saw continuity, not fragility, divine order, not design. They cheered, believing the Medici would rule forever. And perhaps for a brief moment that evening, Vittoria believed it too as she stood on the balcony beside her husband, watching lanterns drift like stars along the Arno, unaware that beneath the glow of that river of light, the first cracks of a dying dynasty were already forming. Heirs and secrets. By the late 1630s, the marble corridors of the Palazzo Pitti had grown heavy with expectation. The bells that once rang in celebration of Vittoria's marriage now tolled with impatience. The court whispered of lineage and duty of heirs that had not yet come. The young Grand Duchess moved through this world like a figure from a painting, composed of devout, luminous under candlelight, but surrounded by the shadows of unspoken doubt. At 24, Grand Duke Ferdinando II had fulfilled his political role, but not yet his biological one. Every dynasty feared the same silence, the silence of empty nurseries. Physicians, confessors, and astrologers offered counsel, and in 1639 their prayers seemed briefly answered. A son was born wrapped in crimson silk and baptized with trumpets sounding across Florence, but the joy lasted only 2 days. The child's tiny lungs failed before his name could echo through the city. 18 months later it happened again, another infant, another brief heartbeat, another funeral. The people murmured about curses, the doctors about the frailty of the blood. The Medici, who once commanded the world's greatest artists, now could not command life itself. In those years, Vittoria's faith hardened into armour. She spent hours in private chapels, the scent of incense clinging to her gowns. She fasted, prayed, and offered jewels to saints. But prayer could not erase the chill that had settled between husband and wife. Ferdinando, always distant, became almost spectral in his avoidance. He buried himself in his experiments, his observatories, his studies of optics and chemistry, a man of science seeking refuge from the mysteries of his own household. And then came the scandal. One evening, as legend has it, Vittoria entered her husband's private chambers unannounced. There, by the flicker of candlelight, she found him in bed with a young page, a servant boy of striking beauty, the son of a noble family fallen into service. The details vary depending on the chronicler, but all agree that the discovery was catastrophic. In a court that lived and breathed on reputation, such a revelation was both intimate and political. Homosexuality in 17th century Italy occupied a paradoxical space, officially condemned by the church, yet tacitly tolerated among the elite so long as it remained hidden. Florence, birthplace of the Renaissance and of Leonardo da Vinci's forbidden loves, had long harboured a quiet tradition of indulgence cloaked in discretion. But for a reigning duke, the scandal was different. To be known as a man who neglected his wife, who risked the lineage, who broke the holy contract of marriage that was political blasphemy. Within hours, the court knew. Servants whispered in corridors, ambassadors sent coded letters to Vienna, to Rome, to Paris. The Medici secret, once whispered, became currency. To foreign powers it was proof of weakness, to the church a reminder that even princes could sin. And what of Vittoria? Her response was silence, the silence of dignity cold and unbroken. She neither wept publicly nor sought revenge. Instead, she turned inward, deeper into faith, deeper into ritual. Those who saw her at Mass said her face seemed carved in marble, her gaze fixed on eternity, rather than the gossip that swirled around her. To the courtiers, her composure was unnerving. To the clergy, it was saintly. In truth, it was survival. For a woman of her station, humiliation could be fatal. But Vittoria had learned in the convent what few men understood, that silence, when wielded carefully, could become its own form of power. The duchess who did not cry became the duchess no one could touch. Years passed in a kind of glacial stillness. The couple lived separate lives under the same roof. Ferdinando hosted scholars, philosophers, and inventors, his rooms filled with telescopes and globes rather than family portraits. Vittoria, in turn, filled hers with relics, priests, and paintings of martyrs. Their household became a map of contradiction science, on one wing scripture on the other, each illuminated by its own kind of light. And yet in the strange mathematics of history, such distances sometimes circle back into alignment. By 1642, perhaps through duty, perhaps through mercy, they found themselves together again, at least for a time. That summer, the long-awaited cry of an infant broke through the silence. Cosimo III de' Medici was born healthy and strong. His birth was greeted as an act of divine reconciliation, the child of two divided souls. Florence rejoiced. Church bells rang until dawn. The child was named for Cosimo, the great founder of the Medici dynasty, a name meant to summon fortune, perhaps to ward off decline. Vittoria oversaw every aspect of his upbringing. He was baptized beneath frescoes that once celebrated humanist triumphs, but now echoed with prayers of penitence. She insisted on a childhood of rigorous piety, of confession and obedience. The boy would grow into the most devout Medici in generations, austere, moralizing, burdened by the same heavy inheritance of faith and fragility. But joy in Vittoria's life never lingered long. Ferdinando's distance deepened once again. After the birth of an heir, he seemed to consider his duty complete. To the outside world, the marriage endured. Behind closed doors, it was a frozen alliance. Florence, ever watchful, invented its own stories. Some said the Duke had taken new favourites. Others whispered that Vittoria's severity had driven him away. Gossip was Florence's second religion and Vittoria its unwilling saint. Yet she endured untouched by scandal, cloaked in the authority of moral virtue. 17 long years passed without another child. The Duchess devoted herself to education, to charity, to quiet service. She built altars and endowed convents, finding in religion the order that her marriage lacked. Her correspondence with church officials grew into networks of influence, a spiritual counterbalance to her husband's secular salons. Then in 1659, an unexpected peace. Accounts speak of a fragile reconciliation, a meeting arranged by their son perhaps, or by sheer fatigue with years of estrangement. The two met privately without attendance in the quiet of the palace gardens. What passed between them remains unrecorded. But 9 months later, on a cold November morning in 1660, a second son was born, Francesco Maria de' Medici. The city marvelled the miracle of renewal after 2 decades of silence. Vittoria, now nearly 40, saw in him both an answer and a warning. She thanked God for mercy, yet in her prayers she added a line seldom spoken aloud, that the sins of the fathers would not return in the sons. In that hope, delicate, trembling, half divine, the Duchess began the second act of her life, one that would test not her beauty or lineage but her endurance. The iron prayer of a duchess. By the mid-17th century, the Palazzo Pitti had become 2 worlds under one roof. On one side, Grand Duke Ferdinand of the Mitucats, Florence, a haven for scientists, mathematicians and dreamers who believed that truth could be found through glass lenses and burning stars. On the other, Vittoria della Rovere's, Florence a citadel of incense relics and prayer, where salvation was measured in confession, not calculation. Between these two spheres hung a silence thick enough to divide centuries. Ferdinando's court glittered with intellect. In 1657 he founded the Accademia del Commento, a pioneering scientific society whose motto, provando e riprovando, meant experiment and verify. Here men of vision peered through telescopes, dissected the laws of heat and air, and whispered the forbidden name of Galileo Galilei, the condemned Florentine genius who had dared to make the heavens measurable. Ferdinando himself, though cautious of the church's gaze, quietly supported these thinkers, providing them laboratories and instruments within his palaces. For him, candlelight was a tool of discovery. Wax melted not before the Virgin, but before experiments, droplets of flame illuminating the hidden clockwork of the cosmos. Across the marble courtyard, Vittoria knelt before another kind of altar. Her rooms were filled with crucifixes and portraits of saints. Her candlelight burned in supplication, not inquiry. Each flame represented a penance, a plea, a proof of faith. If her husband sought to know the mind of God through reason, she sought to appease his will through obedience. Together they embodied the two engines of their age, enlightenment and devotion, locked not in battle, but in a long, uneasy duet. Vittoria ruled her portion of the palace with quiet severity. Courtiers called her La Duchessa di Ferro, the Iron Duchess, not for cruelty, but for unyielding piety. Under her influence, entertainments grew fewer, sermons longer. She enforced modesty among her ladies. She banned scandalous fashions imported from Paris and discouraged the flirtations that once gave the Florentine salons their hum. For the Grand Duchess sin began not in deed, but in suggestion, and beauty unguarded was temptation invited. Those who sought her favour learned that virtue was her currency. Artists and abbots alike courted her patronage by painting Madonnas, not muses. Musicians composed hymns rather than sonnets. Even her charities carried the weight of penance. She endowed convents, where fallen women were hidden away, their repentance measured in hours of prayer. To the outside world she seemed a living saint. To those within the court she was an immovable wall of propriety. The young whispered that she had frozen Florence's spirit. The old thanked her for restoring its soul. Meanwhile, Ferdinando's salons continued discreetly but persistently. Astronomers and physicians gathered under frescoed ceilings, studying nature as if decoding scripture. The palace glowed with two kinds of light, one of candles before relics, one of glass reflecting the cosmos. From afar, the city must have seemed like an illuminated manuscript, the holy and the human, written on opposite pages, yet bound together by history's spine. It was not simply a marriage that had fractured. It was an era dividing against itself. Across Europe, the world was changing. Descartes wrote that reason alone could define existence. Pascal answered that the heart knew what reason could not. Empires built observatories beside cathedrals, laboratories beneath monasteries. Faith and knowledge danced in a dangerous embrace, each claiming to reveal truth, each suspecting the other of pride. In Florence, the dance took place within a single palace. Vittoria's devotion was not gentle. It was militant, born of loss, honed by humiliation and perfected by habit. Her confessor once wrote that she prayed as others breathe and breathes only when she prays. She saw in faith a discipline as rigorous as her husband's experiments. Both sought order in chaos, certainty amid doubt. Yet her order came from surrender, his from questioning, two paths spiralling toward the same unreachable centre. At night, their candles burned in separate chambers. His light trembled over instruments of brass and glass, the beginnings of telescopes and thermometers. Hers glowed across icons gilded with centuries of belief. The air between them carried the faint hum of both science and psalm, one measuring the universe, the other measuring the soul. And yet within this strange duality, Florence endured. The Medici court, even divided, remained a beacon proof that contradiction could be civilization's engine. Under Ferdinando's patronage, the sciences quietly advanced. Under Vittoria's, art found sanctuary in reverence. Her influence preserved the old sanctity of Tuscany's faith even as the world tilted towards reason. Those who served at court learned to navigate both suns, to quote Aristotle in the Duke's presence, and Aquinas in the Duchess's. It was said that one could move from heaven to earth simply by crossing the courtyard. But behind the grandeur, both husband and wife aged in solitude. Ferdinando's health declined. His nights grew longer, his appetite for company dimmer. Vittoria's austerity hardened into habit. Her smiles, once rare, disappeared entirely. Visitors described her as stately, even beautiful, but distant, like a statue that could pray. In the palace chapel, she commissioned new silver candlesticks, tall, severe, gleaming like swords. She said they represented vigilance light that cuts through darkness. Perhaps she meant it as a metaphor for faith. Perhaps it was also a quiet challenge to her husband's world of experiment, her light against his. Philosophers later said the 17th century was an age of paradox when men measured stars and yet feared sin. when reason bloomed in the same soil as superstition. But for Vittoria, the paradox was personal somehow. Her entire life was an act of devotion carried out beneath a ceiling painted by skeptics. By 1670, the palace's twin flames were dimming. Ferdinando's body, long weakened by illness, faltered. As he lay dying, the Accademia del Cimento quietly dissolved. Its experiments ceased, its instruments packed away. Science lost its patron. In the silence that followed, Vittoria returned to his bedside, not as wife, not as lover, but as witness. When he finally exhaled, she is said to have whispered a prayer, not of triumph, but of release. The age of experiment was over. The age of penitence had begun. And in that dim chamber, lit by a single trembling candle, the two flames of Florence reason and faith flickered one last time together before the wax ran dry. The House of Quarrels. The year 1670 opened under the sound of funeral bells. Grand Duke Ferdinando II lay entombed beneath the Basilica of San Lorenzo, and Florence, city of light art and argument, wore black. The court mourned him with ceremony but few tears. The Duke had been gentle, scholarly, distracted, a patron of ideas more than of people. The flame of the Medici torch passed now to his son Cosimo III, a man moulded by his mother's iron faith and his father's sense of divine order. When Vittoria della Rovere emerged from mourning, she did not weep. She prayed, then stood straighter than before. At 48, she had become Florence's matriarch, in all but title a dowager duchess. Yes, but also a force that no minister dared cross. Her influence flowed quietly through the palace corridors like incense, invisible, persistent and suffocating. The city soon learned that the widow's hand still steered the ship of state. Cosimo, dutiful and devout, sought her approval in all things. Every appointment, every decree, every policy bore her shadow. The council chamber that had once echoed with men's voices now hushed whenever she entered. Her black veils, heavy and precise, rustled like wings of judgment. Florence had gained a ruler in name, but it was his mother who ruled in spirit. For a brief moment, stability seemed possible. The Medici line had heirs, the duchy had order. But then came the bride, and with her the unravelling. In 1661, even before his father's death, Cosimo had married Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, niece of King Louis XIV of France. The match, arranged with great fanfare, was supposed to join the piety of Tuscany with the splendour of Versailles. What arrived instead was dynamite. Marguerite Louise was brilliant, proud, and French to the core, bred for salons, not sermons. She despised the dull rituals of Florentine court life and found her husband's sanctity unbearable. Cosimo, raised by a mother who equated joy with sin, regarded his wife's vivacity as proof of corruption. Their quarrels began within days of the wedding. "You pray too much," she once told him. "And you not at all," he replied. Every room became a battlefield. He forbade her from dancing, she mocked his confessor. He imposed fasting, she drank wine in public, daring him to object. Rumours multiplied like ivy. Some claimed she struck him during an argument. Others said he locked her in her chambers for defiance. The servants learned to walk silently, for words carried quickly to the dowager's wing where Vittoria listened. If Florence had ever known peace, it ended there. Vittoria saw in her daughter-in-law the spectre of chaos, a woman ungoverned by piety, too French, too free. In her eyes, Marguerite Louise represented everything that had poisoned the century vanity heresy, disobedience disguised as charm. She urged her son to stand firm as his father never had. He obeyed. To the courtiers, the palace became a theatre of tension. They whispered of shouting matches that lasted until midnight, of priests summoned to mediate between husband and wife. The French ambassador wrote to Paris, "The Palazzo Pitti has become a house of quarrels, its nights filled with the sound of slammed doors and the echo of prayers." Florence watched in fascination. The city that had once witnessed the dramas of princes and painters now watched a domestic tragedy unfold in real time. From the windows of the Uffizi, scholars debated which power ruled stronger, reason, passion, or religion. Vittoria's presence loomed over it all. She never shouted, never raged, but her judgment was absolute. Discipline, she told Cosimo, is the truest form of mercy. To Marguerite she was coldly courteous, addressing her as Madame la Duchessa, a title that sounded more like an accusation than an honour. If Marguerite was a flame, Vittoria was granite. The two women collided endlessly, each testing the limits of her invisible power. When Marguerite began attending masquerades in defiance of court protocol, Vittoria quietly ordered the musicians dismissed halfway through the ball. When Marguerite tried to introduce French fashions, plunging necklines, jewelled wigs, Vittoria banned them under the pretext of moral reform. There were moments when the palace felt less like a home and more like a monastery besieged by theatre. Their feuds spilled into the streets. Pamphlets appeared anonymously mocking the pious prison of Florence. The French faction accused the Medici of tyranny. The Italians called Marguerite a heretic. Every quarrel became a diplomatic issue. The shadow of Louis XIV himself stretched across Tuscany. Within this storm, Cosimo crumbled. His temperament, always delicate, turned severe. He withdrew from public life, retreating into confession and fasts. He trusted no one but his mother, whose counsel came wrapped in scripture. To outsiders, he seemed a saint. To those within the palace, a ghost haunting his own reign. Vittoria had won, but the victory was a wound. In 1675, after 14 years of warfare disguised as marriage, Marguerite Louise fled. Under the pretext of visiting France, she crossed the Alps and never returned. The escape stunned Europe. The Grand Duchess of Tuscany, wife of the most devout prince in Italy, had abandoned her children and her crown. Versailles rejoiced quietly. Florence exhaled in scandalized relief. Her 3 children, Ferdinando, Anna Maria Luisa, and Gian Gastone, were left behind. Vittoria took them into her household, raising them with the same strictness she had once imposed on their father. For the second time in her life, she became both guardian and jailer. Those who saw her at Mass in those years said she had aged without softening. Her eyes, once sharp as steel, now carried a permanent shadow, the look of one who had witnessed the slow disintegration of her own dynasty from within. Florence too seemed to mirror her mood. The city's spirit, once radiant with art, had dimmed. The laughter of Michelangelo's century had long gone silent. The Renaissance had hardened into ritual. Behind every church door, confession replaced curiosity, and in the Palazzo Pitti, beneath frescoes of divine harmony, a family consumed itself in whispered recrimination. History remembers kings for the wars they fought, but it remembers duchesses for the wars they endured. Vittoria's battlefield was domestic, invisible, eternal. Her power came not from armies or titles, but from endurance, a woman who ruled because no one else could. In the end, Florence remained outwardly serene, its streets glowing in Tuscan gold. But if one listened closely at night when the wind moved through the palace courtyards, one could still hear the echoes, the soft, bitter music of a house divided against itself. The last matriarch. The year 1675 left Florence in uneasy silence. The scandal of Marguerite Louise's flight still rippled through Europe. The French princess, who had defied her husband, abandoned her crown and fled across the Alps. In her absence, the city spoke of sin and scandal, of divine punishment and French arrogance. But inside the Palazzo Pitti, the truth was simpler. Vittoria della Rovere had at last the household she always wanted, ordered, disciplined, and hers alone. Her son Cosimo did not protest. He withdrew deeper into piety, half convinced that his wife's rebellion was a judgment upon his sins. The children were left in Vittoria's hands, 3 fragile branches of a withering tree. There was Ferdinando, the eldest, charming yet frail. Anna Maria Luisa, the bright and dutiful girl destined to guard the family's legacy. And Gian Gastone, the youngest, pale and moody, already showing the peculiar melancholy that ran like a curse through Medici veins. They were in essence the continuation of her dynasty, but also living proof of its exhaustion. The doctors spoke softly among themselves. The children's constitutions were weak, their tempers unpredictable. Ferdinando suffered from bouts of fever that left him shaking. Gian Gastone displayed strange fits of silence followed by eruptions of temper. Even their faces bore the unmistakable stamp of centuries of cousinhood, the narrow jaws, the sallow skin, the fragile bones that seemed carved too finely to endure. Each morning Vittoria watched them file into her chambers for lessons. Tutors bowed low, priests murmured blessings. She oversaw every detail, their tutors, their diet, their confessions. The palace, once an arena of quarrels, had become a cloistered academy of obedience. Yet behind her discipline hid something more complicated, a second motherhood born not of tenderness but of duty sharpened by fear. At night she would sit by her window overlooking the Arno, its surface dark and restless under the moon. The river had always comforted her, constant, unjudging, eternal. But now its murmurs seemed to echo her thoughts that love in her hands had hardened into control, that her desire to protect had become a cage. When she prayed before sleep, her words were fervent yet uncertain. She thanked God for preserving her family, then begged forgiveness for shaping it too tightly. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the candle's flicker, an old woman in black, surrounded by portraits of younger selves, the bride, the mother, the duchess. She barely recognized any of them. Florence, too, seemed aged beyond its years. The city that once painted saints and muses now painted genealogies. The Medici wealth that had built cathedrals and funded genius was now spent preserving its own reflection. The dynasty no longer expanded, it imploded, one marriage, one birth, one death at a time. Vittoria sensed it, though she never admitted it aloud. She saw it in the way Ferdinando coughed blood into his handkerchief, in the restless way Gian Gastone avoided her gaze in Anna Maria's anxious perfection. She had raised them to be strong, but she had also raised them to be afraid of sin, of scandal, of failure. Their hearts beat not with ambition, but with caution. And still Florence revered her. To the city she was the last matriarch, the embodiment of piety, wisdom, and continuity. Pilgrims sought her blessing, Noble women modelled their virtue upon her restraint. Artists painted her as a living relic, a Madonna aged but unbroked. Ministers bowed when she entered council chambers, though she no longer held office. Her silence, once considered aloof, had become sacred. But the cost of such reverence was loneliness. In the quiet hours before dawn, she sometimes wandered the gallery of portraits, generations of Della Rovere and Medici staring back at her, the faces blurred together, popes and princes, duchesses and generals, all bound by the same blood that had both elevated and doomed them. Beneath their gold frames, she whispered, prayers that felt less like devotion and more like apology. There were moments of tenderness still. When young Anna Maria Luisa would read aloud from scripture, Vittoria would rest a trembling hand upon her granddaughter's hair, feeling the warmth of life continuing fragile, defiant. She saw in the girl something of her self-intelligence, shaped by duty, compassion, restrained by fear, and perhaps that frightened her most of all. The world beyond Florence was changing. France danced under Louis XIV's mirrored ceilings. England whispered of liberty and science. The new age of ideas began to dawn, but within the Palazzo Pitti, time moved differently each year, repeating the rituals of the last. To outsiders, it seemed a court of serene holiness. To those inside, it was a mausoleum lit by candles. Visitors described the palace as immaculate, ordered, quiet to the point of dread, as one French ambassador wrote, as though the air itself kneels before her. Vittoria walked its corridors daily, her rosary clicking, like a clock, measuring the slow death of her line. She prayed for her grandchildren's health, but she also prayed for purpose, that their lives might redeem what her own generation had broken. Yet even as she prayed, she sensed what history would soon confirm, that she was not saving her family, only prolonging its decline. In her later years, she withdrew further from public life. Her evenings were spent in reflection, the soft murmur of the Arno beneath her window, the wax melting on her candles, the faint smell of lilies brought from the convent garden. Each sound, each scent carried the same message: all things pass. Still she prayed not for victory, but for understanding. Perhaps she realized too late that dynasties do not end through weakness, but through excess, through the suffocation of their own perfection. And so the last matriarch of Florence kept her vigil, a woman who had conquered scandal, tamed rebellion, and outlived her rivals, yet could not escape the slow erosion of her own legacy. When dawn rose over the city, her window would catch the first light on the river. She would sit there quietly, eyes closed, listening. To others, it was merely the Arno's endless whisper. To Vittoria, it was the voice of history itself, murmuring patient and indifferent. The end of the fire. By the time Vittoria della Rovere withdrew to Pisa, the world she had ruled no longer existed. The palace that once trembled beneath her footsteps now echoed with a gentler rhythm. Servants moving quietly, bells tolling softly from distant churches, the tide of the Arno sighing beyond her windows. Pisa, milder and more forgiving than Florence, became her refuge in old age. The salt air eased her lungs, the grey light flattered no one. Here at 70, she devoted herself to what she had always understood best: order. She visited convents she had endowed decades earlier, their courtyards blooming with rosemary and silence. She financed the repair of altarpieces, the education of orphaned girls, and the endless copying of sacred texts. The nuns adored her not for her gentleness, but for her certainty. To them she was not a duchess, but a saint of discipline, the embodiment of faith rendered flesh. Yet even in this twilight of prayer and charity, the past clung to her. The portraits that travelled with her husband, her sons, her ancestors, hung on the damp walls of the ducal apartments, their eyes watching as if waiting for a confession that would never come. The candles that burned before them melted slowly into pools of wax, and each night she wondered which flame would go out first, theirs or hers. Florence still wrote to her son Cosimo III, now a sorrowful man trapped between tyranny and faith. His letters were long, apologetic, filled with melancholy. He ruled a duchy too devout to live, too proud to change. Under him, Tuscany shrank inward, the economy stalled, the court grew sterile, and the laughter that once echoed through Medici halls was replaced by psalms. Vittoria read his words and recognized her own reflection. She had taught him to pray, but not to hope. Her younger son, Cardinal Francesco Maria, fared no better. The church had offered him dignity, but no purpose. He drifted between Rome and Siena, a man of ceremony, not conviction. Only the grandchildren, the last fragile heirs of her long labour, still occupied her prayers. And then, one by one, they too began to fade. Her grandson Ferdinando, the heir, died young, childless, his body exhausted by the very delicacy of his breeding. The youngest, Gian Gaston, would inherit the throne reluctantly, preferring wine and solitude to rule. The last Medici would become a melancholy curiosity, a prince who shunned his court, slept by day, and entertained beggars by night. Even his sister, Anna Maria Luisa, though loyal and cultured, knew the truth that she would be the custodian of memories, not the maker of them. In Pisa, the news arrived slowly, carried by couriers who bowed low but brought grief in their hands. Vittoria accepted each letter in silence, tracing the seals before breaking them reading by the trembling light of her candles. She did not weep. She had outlived too many to waste tears. By March of 1604, her health had begun to fail. The doctors spoke of dropsy, the slow drowning of the body in its own stillness. She knew the signs. For days she refused food, taking only water blessed by her confessor. On her final evening, she requested the window be opened. The air that entered was cool and salted, carrying with it the faintest hum of the sea. As the nuns prayed, she whispered a final invocation, not for her soul, but for her family. Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. When she died, the candles in her chamber burned all the way down to their bases. One monk later wrote that as the last flame sputtered, the dawn light entered through the shutters as if heaven and earth had agreed to exchange guardianship. She was buried in San Lorenzo beside the husband who had betrayed her, the son who had obeyed her, and the ancestors who had built the world she tried so desperately to preserve. Around her tomb, marble angels knelt in frozen devotion, but beneath them the blood of two great houses lay still. For a time her lineage lingered dim but alive. Cosimo reigned in sorrow until 1723. Then came Gian Gastone, reclusive, scandalous and kind in strange, exhausted ways. He ruled not by decree but by indifference. When he died in 1737, childless and alone, the Medici torch went out after 300 years of brilliance and decay. Florence fell silent like a theatre after the last act. Yet the story did not end in silence. In the centuries that followed, travellers wandering through Florence found the city haunted by its past, not by ghosts but by art. The Titian paintings Vittoria had inherited from the Della Rovere, the jewels and reliquaries she had preserved, all found their way into the galleries her granddaughter Anna Maria Luisa later opened to the public. She could not save the bloodline, but she saved the beauty it left behind. In the Uffizi Gallery, amid the hush of marble halls, those paintings still breathe. The colours remain the same reds that once adorned Vittoria's wedding robes, the same blues that lit the ceilings of Urbino, where her story began. Visitors stand before them and feel something they cannot quite name, the echo of a vanished world. Perhaps that is the truest immortality dynasties can claim, not in power, not in heirs, but in the persistence of beauty. The brushstrokes of the Renaissance outlasted the blood that commissioned them. The art became confession. The canvases the soul. Somewhere in the shimmer of oil and gold leaf, Vittoria della Rovere endures not as a duchess or widow or mother, but as a flicker of light that refused to die. The candles have long since burned out, but the galleries still glow, the stones remember, the names fade, the art endures.